Eh,
Oigan, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Es un placer que estén en esta mesa virtual acompañándonos. Y bueno, pues a nombre de Wapor Latinoamérica les damos la más cordial bienvenida esta mañana de viernes. En esta ocasión, pues para escuchar la presentación de Lucas de Abreu, ¿no? Quien nos hablará acerca de los derechos civiles de la población LGBT a través de un estudio de la evidencia que nos va a presentar en América Latina. Esto forma parte de un programa de conferencias, de mesas redondas y de participaciones que en Wapor Latam hemos impulsado a través de las actividades de este segundo semestre del año. La verdad, agradecemos mucho la posibilidad de que haya sido a través del doctor Fabián Echegaray, que sea posible que hoy podamos escuchar a Lucas, ¿no? Y bueno, pues la más cordial bienvenida a todos y a todas, y a quienes ya forman parte de la comunidad, de esta comunidad de Wapor Latam, les agradecemos mucho su presencia, y a quienes todavía no forman parte de la comunidad Wapor Latam, les invitamos pues a pertenecer a Wapor y pertenecer a la comunidad de Wapor Latam, y que esperemos que esta mañana sea de provecho para todos y a todas. Muchas gracias, mi querido Fabián, y el micro es tuyo.
bueno, muchas gracias Gustavo, muchas gracias a todos los que están participando del evento. Espero que el eco no continúe, a pesar de que sí parece continuar. Bueno, tengo el gusto de presentar a Lucas. Lucas es candidato de doctorado en Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de California, San Diego, y con él continuamos, y con su presentación continuamos ampliando la agenda de temas de Wapor Latam, tradicionalmente más focada en temas electorales, de comunicación política o en temas amplios de opinión pública vinculados con popularidad presidencial. Y justamente su presentación, así como otras que ocurrieron este año, el ciclo de conferencias y webinars de esta nueva gestión que estamos administrando con Gustavo, ha sido con el objetivo de contemplar esos otros temas relevantes de la agenda que siempre dialogaron con algunas de las perspectivas tradicionales de la opinión pública. Uno de las fuentes inspiradoras de todos nosotros ha sido el trabajo de Ronald Inglehart, recientemente fallecido, sobre valores postmaterialistas, y ciertamente una de las formas de entender esa expansión del aspecto ciudadano, del aspecto político, en comportamientos o en actitudes que tradicionalmente se las vinculaba al ámbito de lo privado, contempla justamente esa politización de temas como los derechos civiles o como las preferencias en términos de consumo o de identidad o de orientación. Y a partir de allí entonces vimos la necesidad de traer algunas de las discusiones que habitualmente entrarían como parte de ese temario de temas postmaterialistas o de nuevos temas emergentes de una ciudadanía que va más allá de la versión clásica o de la versión convencional. Lucas ha estudiado comportamiento político, opinión pública, temas de representación política, y antes de volcarse al mundo académico, él trabajó como periodista en dos de los medios más conocidos de Brasil, o Estado de São Paulo, que es un diario, y la revista Examen, que es semanal. y también sus comentarios políticos y sus opiniones han aparecido en otros medios prestigiosos de Brasil, como la revista Piauí, la Folha de São Paulo, el periódico Valor Económico y el canal Globo News. El tema entonces de Lucas tiene que ver con un estudio empírico que realizaron en coautoría junto con sus dos colegas Albert Chio y Scott Desposato, y que tiene que ver justamente con la percepción y las consecuencias de la consolidación de los derechos civiles de los grupos LGBT en América Latina. Hasta qué punto ellos generan, digamos, esa consolidación generan un efecto de alineamiento, de simpatía o de liberalización de preferencias, o por el contrario generan polarización y una reacción conservadora contra esos derechos en la región. Y es un tema sumamente actual, particularmente en el caso de Brasil, a partir justamente de la consagración 2 años atrás de un entonces candidato, hoy presidente, que se eligió en parte justamente por su perspectiva reaccionaria con relación a estos temas. Entonces, sin entregarles más detalles, sin hacer spoiler, le cedo la palabra entonces a Lucas para que nos haga navegar sobre su entorno de su investigación, y posteriormente dudas, comentarios, etcétera, los podremos o ir compartiendo por el chat, y después yo los voy resumiendo para que Lucas los vaya respondiendo, o pueden ir anotándolas y después participan con la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Lucas, brigadão, mais uma vez, e the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today and to coming to watch this presentation. I'm really honored to be able to speak here to you all. I apologize for not speaking Spanish. I can understand it, but I feel self-conscious about speaking Spanish, being originally a Portuguese speaker. I could probably try it, but I don't feel quite adequate doing so. And as Fabian said, please feel free to interrupt at any time with questions. Okay, so as Fabian said, this is a paper that I wrote with 2 co-authors. One of them is a professor at UCSD, the University of California in San Diego. Another is now a PhD student at Stanford. So this is a paper that looks at LGBT, at the effect that granting LGBT civil rights in Latin America had on public opinion. Does it increase favorability in favor of LGBT rights, of further LGBT rights, or does it create a backlash effect, right? And I'm gonna go into details about how what we find. We find, as the title says, no evidence of a backlash or polarization. And I'm gonna go into more details. So this question came into particular prominence, as Fabian said, because in the several last years, we've seen a gain of the strength of the political right in Latin America after a long period of strengthening of the left, right? So we saw the right winning elections in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, but obviously Brazil is arguably the most prominent case, because here we have a candidate from the far right who he has identified before as proudly homophobic. He continues to make homophobic jokes, including attacks to journalists and making sexual innuendos about their sexualities, and so on and so forth. So the question that has been posed is this return of the right in the continent an effect of the these cultural issues? What is the role that these so-called cultural symbolic issues played in the resurgence of the right in the continent? To what extent is granting or the advancement of LGBT rights in the continent linked to the election of Bolsonaro and other far-right candidates, or even just right candidates, conservative candidates? So the question, as I said, is, does granting LGBT rights or minority rights, broadly speaking, so does granting minority rights create a backlash effect on the majority? And this has been a long-standing debate, right? So, do we have a question? Okay. So, since the civil rights for African Americans in the United States back in the 60s, it has been argued, scholars have been arguing, that granting minority rights creates a backlash in the majority. So the argument is that granting civil rights to African Americans in the United States in the 60s and 70s created a backlash among whites, right? Likewise, it has also been argued that the liberalization of abortion rights in the US also created a backlash effect on the population as a whole. The evidence is mixed, but I'm going to go into more detail. So the question that we're trying to address is precisely that. How does granting minority rights affect the attitudes, the opinions of the majority of the population? The case of LGBT rights in Latin America is particularly interesting and particularly adept to answering this question, right? So in the last 2 decades, Latin America has seen LGBT rights gains compared to advanced countries, including like Europe, for example. So we've seen several countries in the continent granting rights such as same-sex marriage, civil unions, anti-discrimination legislation, and so on and so forth. So several countries in the continent have granted civil rights, LGBT civil rights. However, the continent remains religious. It is still a developing continent. It's by no means as developed in terms of economic or even democratic development as countries with similar levels of LGBT rights, such as Europe. It is still religious. It's still a relatively poorly educated continent, right? So it is we argue in this paper that if we were to observe a backlash effect anywhere, we should observe it in Latin America, okay? So what is our contribution? So we gathered every LGBT right granted in the continent up to 2020. So since these countries became independent till today, so that's a large range of facts. So we gather all these rights and we we merge those rights to public opinion in the continent. We link those two. And by linking those two, we are able to establish whether or not granting rights affect public opinion at all. And I will go into more detail about the data sources that we use, okay? And then we try to analyze. And we then we test for the rights, the average effects on the population. So basically seeing that if the population as a whole respond to those changes in LGBT rights. We then also test to effects in key demographics. So do particular groups react differently, such as the religious, the poorly educated? Do we observe heterogeneous effects among these key constituencies? And then we also test for polarization. Perhaps we don't observe an effect overall, but perhaps people just get more polarized. Those who are in favor become more favorable, and those who were opposed become more opposed. All right, so what has previous research shown? Contradictory results. Some scholars have argued that we observe backlash, so granting minority rights make the majority against those rights, against those minorities. Other scholars have argued the opposite, have argued that people become more favorable. Others say that actually what we are observing is polarization. So as I said, perhaps those who were in favor previously became more favorable, and those who were opposed became more opposed. So what is the data that we're using for this analysis? So we created this index that we call the Latin American Rainbow Index. It's basically an index of every LGBT right granted in the continent throughout the years, okay? And we merged that with the LAPOP data set, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So this is just a huge survey conducted in the continent every 2 years or so, okay? So here's how we construct what we're calling the LARI. The LARI is the Latin American Rainbow Index again, and we tracked these 8 rights across 16 countries, every country in the continent excluding the Caribbean. So we're not including the Caribbean, just South America and Central America. So we tracked 8 rights. So we tracked the decriminalization of homosexual activities, right to serve openly in the military, right to donate blood by men who have sex with men, protection against discrimination. So this is like, oh, if you fire someone for being gay, can this person basically sue their employers and so on and so forth. So any protection against discrimination, some form of gender recognition for transgender people, civil unions, so same-sex civil unions and same-sex marriage. And finally, adoption by same-sex couples. And as I said, across all the countries in the continent. So here you can see the distribution of rights for each country over time. It's very interesting. You have countries, especially in Central America, with few to non-civil rights to Latin America, to LGBT people. And you also see rights that were granted very back in the day, in the 19th century, right? These were basically the discrimination, decriminalization of homosexual acts, right? So when the first constitutions for many countries in the continent were created, they excluded homosexual acts as a crime. Most rights, though, have been granted, in the vast majority, have been granted in the last 2 decades, right? So you see that in the case of Colombia, for example. Colombia is the country with the most LGBT rights, mostly pushed by the judiciary. Brazil and Argentina are also countries with a large number of LGBT rights. And then you have curious cases such as Chile, where you have a relatively developed country with a relatively educated population, but still relatively few civil rights for LGBT people. Any questions so far?
No,
All right.
no, queda para seguir.
Una pregunta, nada más, mirando lo anterior
Of
y
course.
tomando en consideración Chile. ¿Hay relación también, con, por ejemplo, con otro tipo de derechos como la despenalización de la... ¿Pudieron mirar algo de eso? ¿Se entendió?
Mm-hmm. We didn't test for that, so not that I am aware, I don't think.
Okay,
I don't
okay.
think so.
Obrigado.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the LAPOP data set. As I said, sure that most of you are familiar with that, but basically we looked at countries in the continent, excluding the Caribbean. So we had 16 countries from 2004 to 2016. That is the data that I'm gonna present today. We have just updated the results to include 2018, okay? But so far, today I'm only gonna show you the results for 2016. The results are the same when we look to 2018, okay? So there are hundreds of thousands of interviews, 16 countries, etc. All right. So what is our dependent variable? What is the variable that we are looking at here? It is support for two particular variables. So whether or not the respondent in the survey is in favor of same-sex marriage, and whether or not the respondent is in favor of allowing LGBT candidates to run for office. So you might ask, okay, that's a little bit of a weird question, and we agree because it's not an issue that people are talking about, but those were the only two variables included in the LAPOP data sets that have been consistently asked over the years. So that's why we only analyze those two, because those are the two questions for which we have data, okay? So those are our two dependent variables. And then for the polarization models, what we do is that we take the distance from the country mean. So basically we create the mean attitude on those issues, those two issues that I just referred to, favorability of same-sex marriage and favorability of allowing LGBT candidates to run for office. And we take the country mean, and then we subtract the participants' distance from that mean. The argument is if they are moving far, if they are moving away from the country mean, then we should argue that that is an evidence of polarization. Any questions? Okay, so our independent variables. Obviously, the variable that we mostly care about is the LARI, the Latin American Rainbow Index. That is the variable that we are most interested in. And then we have all these covariates, right? So whether or not the respondent lives in an urban or rural environment, the importance of religion for the respondent, education, age, education, age, income, ideology, whether or not they participate politically and whether or not they pay attention to the news. Okay, so those are the questions that we have. And then we interact the index with these covariates, right, to see if we observe difference in what we're calling key constituencies, key demographics. Okay. So our estimated strategy, so we are running a weighted linear model, a probability model. So these are basically regular ordinary least squares, but with different weights for different countries, obviously. And with country and year fixed effects. This is what we call a difference in differences model. So we're able to control for any particularities in each country over time. Okay, and then we use standard errors that are bootstrapped standard errors. I'm happy to go into more detail about that in the Q&A to answer any questions that you might have about the methodology. So let's look at the results here. So this is a coefficient plot with the average effects for the entire population. Again, the closest to zero, the less effect we observe, right, over time. So as you see here, the effects are tiny, very small. So granting rights does not have a significant effect on attitudes, one way or the other. The effects are very small, they're close to zero, and they're not statistically significant. We observe the same thing for polarization. We do not observe any signal of polarization, as you can see in this plot. Okay. So let's talk about heterogeneous effects for age. Here we see what we call marginal effects. So as people get older, do they become less favorable to LGBT rights as these rights increase over time? Yes, the effects are consistent with the hypothesis that younger people are more in favor of LGBT rights, but not statistically significant. So we do not observe any effect with age. What about ideology? Perhaps as people become more conservative, they also become less favorable to LGBT rights as the number of rights increase over time. We also do see the effect is on that direction, but it's not statistically significant, right? It's not statistically significant. Same thing with urban versus rural. Here, the hypothesis is as someone urban individuals would be more likely to support LGBT rights, and rural individuals, individuals living in rural areas should become less favorable as the number of rights increase. And we don't observe any significant effects either. What about education? Perhaps as people become more educated, they become more favorable towards LGBT rights as the number of rights increase. But we also don't observe any significant effects. What about political engagement? Perhaps as people participate in politics, they become more favorable towards LGBT rights, as the number of rights increases, and we do not observe any effect, significant effects either. Income, same as before, no significant effects. Religiosity, again, results are in the expected direction. The more religious someone is, the less likely they are to support LGBT rights as we grant more rights. But again, the effect is not statistically significant. People who are in favor, and also you do something that I forgot to mention here, we also have the results for polarization, right? So neither they do not become more polarized, and we don't observe effects either. What about news attentiveness? So do people who pay closer attention to the news? And here the argument is that you need to pay attention to the news to know that these rights are even being granted, right? We do observe, again, in the direction that people who are aware of these changes, they may become less favorable of granting further LGBT rights, but the effect is not statistically significant. All right, so let's summarize the results, because I showed a bunch of plots to you all. So perhaps I need to, let's focus on the big picture here. So the big picture is granting LGBT rights does not seem to create any effect, be it positive or negative, to the population, in the population as a whole. We also don't observe significant changes in key constituencies that we think are particularly likely to respond to those changes. So age, religious people, you know, the young, the rich, so income, rural versus urban, and so on and so forth. So none of these groups respond significantly different from the population as a whole. And we also don't observe any effect of on polarization on those issues. So what are our key contributions? So what is the takeaway here? Well, so we tested the backlash effects of granting LGBT rights or minority rights on the majority in a continent that should be particularly favorable for these changes, right? Because Latin America has seen a radical increase in LGBT rights over the last 2 decades, but the population has stayed relatively poorly educated, relatively poor, relatively religious compared to developed democracies. But we do not observe any backlash effect. We do not observe any sign of polarization. In addition, we created this index of LGBT rights in the continent that we hope will be used by other researchers in this area. This index, by the way, is available on my website. So, okay, so we are in the process of updating this paper. This paper has received a revise and resubmit at the Journal of Politics, which is one of the 3 main most important and prestigious newspaper journals, academic journals in political science. And so we are in the process of revising the paper. And here's what we are doing. So as I said, as I've mentioned before, we are updating the results to reflect the 2018 LAPOP. We already have those results. They look the same, basically. And then we're also going to look at some additional model specifications. So for example, we are going to look at the effect of being evangelical. Perhaps we observe polarization or backlash among evangelicals. We are also going to look the other way around. Perhaps it's not policy changes that are causing attitudes, but attitudes that are causing changes. So perhaps people first become favorable to LGBT rights, and then because people are more in favor, then we see an effect in increasing rights. We are going to test for that as well. And finally, we're going to look at specific issues, because one critique that we have received is that perhaps the index is just equalizing all issues or treating every issue as the same, right? So and what they're arguing is that same-sex marriage is not the same as, say, anti-discrimination legislation, and that we should look at those issues separately. So we're going to do that as well. All right, so what are the further steps that we encourage other researchers to take in future research, right? So it's very hard, if not impossible, to identify causality with public opinion, right? You can't randomize LGBT rights across countries and see the effect. And you can't randomize people to be in favor or against LGBT rights. So this is very hard to do from a causal standpoint. But we've done the state-of-the-art research in this with public opinion, which is to use a difference in differences model. In addition, but we think more could be done. In particular, we think that survey experiments could be done to see if those rights have make people more or less favorable towards LGBT rights in the continent. We could also try, we could also use panel data. Unfortunately, there are very few publicly available survey panels in Latin America. I've looked for them, I'd love to use them, but I have not been able to find any. So that would also help us identify causality. And then we can, we also think that looking at particular countries, particular cases could also help isolate causality. And finally, the LARI contains the particular source of change. So we have in the index whether or not the change was caused by the judiciary, whether or not it was caused by, driven by the executive or the legislative. And we think that further research could look at how these different sources of rights affects public opinion. All right, so what are the overall implications of our work? Why do we think this work is important? So for decades, scholars and activists have debated whether or not granting civil rights to the minority, to a particular minority, creates a backlash effect on the majority. So our results show that it does not. And that should come as a relief for people activists pushing for minority rights, because you are able to fight, at least in terms of LGBT rights, at least in Latin America, you're able to fight for those rights without creating a backlash effect. And it also suggests that the right played at most a marginal role in the rise of the far right in the continent over the last few years. And finally, as Fabian very correctly put in his introduction, our results are also viewed, are also consistent with an idea of the public that responds to material changes, but not symbolic changes. So it doesn't seem that the public cares all that much for all these symbolic changes if it doesn't affect them directly. Okay. So with that, this is what I had for today, and I look forward for your questions. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Lucas, por la exposición. Creo que ha sido muy clara también en la forma como fuiste guiándonos por los modelos que estuviste trabajando y deja muy transparente tu trabajo, ¿no? Así que felicitaciones, realmente interesante y claro, parece un milagro sin santos, ¿no? Porque hay un muy fuerte apoyo y no hay explicaciones inmediatas o por lo menos los usual suspects para poder dar una primera respuesta. Lo cual me hizo acordar, y yo creo que la pregunta que creo que fue Noelia que la insinuó, nos hace acordar también de cómo fue que se legitimaron, que encontraron legitimidad amplia los derechos humanos en los 80-90, los derechos de los animales a partir de los 90-2000, derechos de poblaciones indígenas o nativas, digamos, parece ser estar justamente esa dimensión simbólica de derechos, parece ser muy abarcativa y poco, en teoría, poco conflictiva. Me queda la pregunta ahí de realmente cuánto más de evidencia hay para afirmar lo de que el contexto latinoamericano should be particularly friendly, como decís, a partir apenas de este endoso tal vez pasivo, ¿no? O by default, que pareciera existir, ¿no? Pero bueno, tengo mis propias preguntas, pero quisiera abrir para los otros colegas que pudieron acompañar. Y bueno, quien tenga alguna duda, lo puede expresar en el idioma que pueda. Si hay alguna duda respecto al sentido, Lucas, tú me falas si tiver alguma dúvida con relación ao espanhol, ahí tento ayudar.
Okay.
Entonces abro para los colegas. ¿Alguien que se voluntaria con alguna pregunta?
Should I answer your okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Lucas.
I was just asking if I should answer to your comments, Fabian, before though.
Only if you need that's urgent. Otherwise, maybe we should collect a few questions and then yeah. Thank you. Mariano?
Yeah, Lucas, this is Mariano Turcal. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. It is very nice to see how more and more, even in different topics, how much more there is a comparative analysis of cross-national data in a way you did it. So congratulations, and the topic is very interesting and I like it because it has a lot of implications beyond the topic itself. So I really like that. So thank you very much. I just want to, I know that you have been a review and recent meet, so now I'm reluctant to make some comments because there is mostly methodological comments that I have to make. I'm always a pain in the ass about that. So sorry about that. I don't know if to tell you, but I really, there is one thing, and mostly you reported fixed effects results. And your argument is based on fixed effects results to test heterogeneity of the effect, which is good. However, you talk about cross-level interactions, which I didn't see to report, unless I missed somehow the whole model, because I didn't see the way reported very clearly to me. But I didn't see that. But anyhow, one thing is more and more clear in the literature on using multi-level and approach to this, and even if you're doing fixed effects, and you're just testing the compositional effects in each country year, it's very important to add random slopes. The more and more literature is saying that, especially for those variables that you're working on, more and more literature is saying that sometimes no including random real slopes, even though you're just testing fixed effects, could bias results, and especially most importantly affect the standard errors. So I wonder you did not. I will suggest you to do that in a robustness checks. But just one idea that just one idea that I would like to suggest to you in all this analysis. When you're testing fixed effects, pretty much you're not testing the underlying idea that is behind your presentation, which is like, are people in Latin America becoming more concerned over time about this issue, and especially there is an increasing relationship between some of your compositional effects with time, in a way. It's like, so for instance, is more religious people becoming more concerned about this? Is this more, and that is an underlying concept. It's increasing polarization, or polarization becoming more relevant over time. And I didn't see that you test that at all. And I'm going to give you some suggestion about this. I think it's very interesting when you start working with multi-level, and I can give you some literature about this, to test something that's distinguishing something is called between conscious effects from within conscious effects. The way to compute the within conscious effects will be just adding time as a variable, a linear or a dummy, and also to include, you know, the mean country difference from the mean country year difference. That way, what you want to have is an indicator where it's going to tell you overall if first at that level, at the within country, which is pretty much time. Okay, is what you're going to notice is that we can test if time on over time some compositional effects interacting with that variable might show that actually this is an increasing in Latin American societies are becoming much more aware, and for instance, and therefore much more conflictual over time, individuals, as time pass. I think that will be very strong. If you do this cross level interaction between the compositional effects, where you test with fixed effects, with the within countries differences over time, I will be much more convinced about your argument, because the way you present it right now, in a way, is like you're not taking into consideration time at all. You're not taking into consideration the evolution of that society at all. What you just saying is like, okay, look, I tested every year, and this is the compositional effect for every country year, and that's it. But you are not including in your model time, and you have a lot of information about time. So my suggestion, I don't know if you want to, is and obviously maybe you don't want to complicate your life because you already are an R. Don't complicate your life. But if you think that is a good strategy to follow in your coming work in this topic, because maybe you find something there. Maybe you find that this compositional effect, especially religion or ideology or something like that, might actually increase over time the effects, and that will be very interesting to see.
Gracias, Mariano.
Okay, so let me. That's very interesting, and some of your comments, thank you so much. They're super helpful, and they are in line with what the reviewers asked. So we are ready. It's in our to-do list. If we haven't done already, I don't know if my co-authors have done it already, but if we haven't, we will do a random slopes model. But I don't think that you're right that we're not taking into account what we would call secular change. We are controlling for that, right? Because we have a year fixed effects, but we're not so much interested in whether or not the continent or any particular country as a whole is becoming more favorable to LGBT rights. That is not the question. I think the answer to that is probably yes. People are becoming more favorable towards LGBT rights over time. I think there's no question about that. The answer is not that. The answer is the question, sorry. The question is not that we're asking. The question is granting, when you grant an LGBT right, do people become more in favor than they would have otherwise, right? So that's why we need the year fixed effects. Because the key variable that we care, unless I misunderstood your point, in which case please feel free to correct me. But the question that we are interested in is, when you observe a policy change, does that affect attitude? Okay, and that is the question. So we could add time as a covariate rather than a fixed effect, but that would be, I think, a different question than the one we're trying to answer. For that matter, we have run a bunch of different legs. So we've tried, okay, what if the policy was enacted 2 years ago? What if it was enacted 10 years ago? What if it was enacted 3 years ago, etc.? We report those in the appendices, and we don't see a lot of change. And that puts, that is also similar. It drives me to a similar topic to the one that Fabian mentioned. He said that this was a miracle without a saint, which I found very interesting. But I don't think it was quite the miracle that supporters of LGBT rights might look for. Ideally, in the ideal world, what you would expect is that granting rights, so once you've granted a right to a minority and the majority of the population see that they were not affected by that, like, so if you grant, if you allow gay people to marry, straight people are going to see that that doesn't affect their lives whatsoever. So people should become more in favor of it, ideally, right? If it truly was if it truly were a miracle, we would want, you know, granting LGBT rights to make people more in favor of LGBT rights. Rather, we don't observe any effect. People simply don't care, right? Because, and here's what we argue in the paper, is that people simply do not care for these symbolic changes, or at least the majority of the population, as much as we might want. And this is consistent with the traditional view of public opinion. People care about things that affect their lives directly, rather than these symbolic changes. So politicians may push for those symbolic issues, but it's simply, and that's fine and important, but the majority of the public do not care for them one way or the other very much. They probably have attitudes on them, they just, it doesn't seem to be like hugely important.
Can I go into that a little more and your answer? Yeah, sorry to be a little bit of pain in the ass about this. I mean, actually, I like it. I like what you're saying, and I agree with you. But if I were to review, I will tell you. Okay, you can treat time as a dummy, and use the policy year change. In other words, the year in which the change has been implemented as your reference. And then I will create an interaction in that respect with, and showing, okay, look, the compositional effect has not changed at all. And that, for me, that will be a very convincing argument of what you're trying to prove.
So are you saying that you would interact our index with time?
I will say my recommendation will be, first I will leave random that will be whatever are you testing, leave it random. I create an interaction with time dummy and make the reference dummy, the reference category for dummy, the year of the policy change. And then, or the other possibilities, or select the first year, times 0 as the reference points, and expecting that the year in which that policy was implemented, that interaction becomes insignificant. That, for me, would be a very convincing argument what you're saying, because I buy your argument. It's not about your theoretical and even empirical argument, because I buy it from a methodological point of view. I don't think you or what you're saying are really supporting what you're saying. Because you're just showing fixed effects, so you know, and yeah, I know, but fixed effects are not capturing. For instance, I'm sure you try to show the residuals of the intercept by country means, like in the multilateral. You will see that there's still some difference that you're not capturing in terms of the evolution of people about the rights of this minority community. So if I were a reviewer and I will write this reviewer to you and I will assess it from a point of view, it's like, okay, I buy your argument, I like it, it's good. You are close to saw it, but you're not fully close to saw it. And from the methodological point of view. And so my suggestion will be doing so. You know, to use time again as a second level variable, just as a dummy, maybe the best strategy will be T0 as a reference in each country, and then you make a list on which countries there was a policy change and it was approved and expected to have a significant interaction for that particular year with your compositional effects. And if you don't see anything there, that's great news for you. You're just like, okay, you are absolutely completely convinced about it.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. I'll think very carefully about that and bring that to my co-authors. Just a small thing you mentioned, to look at specific countries. Unfortunately, we cannot do that because we have, once you go to a particular country, you have relatively few changes, relatively few rights, so we are going to be massively underpowered. We try to do that in the case of Uruguay, for example, that has a lot of LGBT rights, but then you just become massively underpowered because you have these changes. But yeah, thank you so much. I'll think very carefully about that.
I mean, you want to discuss this with more in detail, and you just write to me, Mariano.torcal at upf.edu, and I can discuss and even send you some references on methodological issues on how to handle that.
Thank you so much, Mariano.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gracias, Mariano. Gracias, Lucas. Quería invitar a los otros colegas a preguntar si es que tienen alguna consulta, algún comentario. Si no, aprovecho entonces para... Bueno, una de las preguntas que me generó... bueno, voy acá a reproducir una de las preguntas de los que nos acompañan. Manuela pregunta, when we analyze environmental action in Brazil, we repeatedly find there's a gap between what people say and what people do. For example, people say conserving nature is important, but don't act accordingly. For example, signing petitions or riding a bike or taking low emissions behavior. Do you believe there's such a difference also about what people declare of in relation to LGBT rights?
That's a great question. I think the case of environmental policy is a little different, right? Because this is, so first of all, the vast majority of people are not politically engaged at all. People simply have too much to do with their lives to be engaged in politics, in any political activity, like signing petitions or anything like that. That is too much to ask from most people who are just trying to live, right? And I think the environmental policy is a little different because it does affect people directly. And people do, so for example, you might say, oh, I'm against deforestation, but then you might benefit directly if you're a farmer by deforesting your area. So I think those issues are not entirely comparable because people do have benefits to acquire directly when they get to affect the environment in any way. Or reversely, you could also argue that everybody is going to be directly affected by climate change, for example. So I don't think the issues are directly comparable. Does that answer your question, Manuela?
Gracias, Lucas, gracias, Manuela.
Yeah, thank you.
Por la pregunta. Manuela, ¿algún comentario adicional? Pode ser em português diretamente.
Sim, pois é. Não, é só que as pessoas não sentem diretamente a questão das mudanças climáticas, né? Apesar de afetar a vida delas, elas não sentem esse efeito, né? Então, por isso que me ocorre essa questão, que talvez também na questão do quanto as pessoas estão familiarizadas com os direitos civis para esse grupo, né, que é considerado minoritário, enfim, o quanto elas realmente declaram aquilo que elas pensam, de verdade, né? A distância que existe entre uma coisa e outra.
Você toca numa questão muito importante, que é o que a gente chama em inglês de desirability bias. Pode ser que as pessoas estejam respondendo à pesquisa o que elas acham que o entrevistador quer ouvir, que elas não pensem isso de verdade. Mas isso é um problema com tudo que a gente faz em opinião pública, como vocês sabem. É muito difícil controlar para isso, controlar esse efeito. Então, realmente, isso é uma questão. Agora, eu acho que no caso de política ambiental é mais difícil, realmente, porque, diferentemente da questão dos direitos LGBT estão avançando, a questão ambiental está regredindo, né? Então,
Sim.
É muito difícil, porque, diferentemente, você legalizar o casamento entre pessoas do mesmo sexo não afeta as pessoas heterossexuais at all. Já você, por exemplo, criar um carbon tax, um imposto sobre carbono, vai afetar muita gente. Então, você tem perdedores reais na política ambiental, enquanto na política de direitos civis você não tem perdedores, entendeu? Não tem. Então é muito mais difícil fazer política ambiental do que garantir direitos civis.
Gracias, Manu, gracias, Lucas. Bueno, antes de la próxima pregunta me gustaría introducir que en realidad dialoga con uno de los comentarios de Mariano, porque justamente agarras un periodo en el cual en muchos de nuestros países, ¿no? 2004, 2016, fueron gobiernos progresistas los que estuvieron en el Ejecutivo, ¿no? Y me extraña, y justamente esos gobiernos progresistas se anclaron en la idea de ir creando o alimentando una nueva generación más simpática o más liberal respecto de sus puntos de vista sobre determinados temas como las relaciones entre personas del mismo sexo o, como mencionaba Manu, temas ambientales o derechos feministas o derechos sobre el cuerpo, como el aborto. Y realmente me extraña que no hayan encontrado ningún efecto de socialización y hasta qué punto abrieron entonces dentro del mismo grupo de edad a lo largo del tiempo un análisis para ver si la correlación cambiaba en algo, se acentuaba, digamos, dentro del mismo, para el grupo de 18 a 25, 18 a 29 en el 2004, y comparándolo con el grupo de 2016, si esa relación no se intensificaba, o de hecho, como ustedes se encuentran, se dio con la misma intensidad a lo largo de esos 12 años, ¿no? O si por acaso en algún país se intensificó más, y en términos colectivos, en términos agregados, esa mayor correlación fue anestesiada o neutralizada por lo que sucedió en alguna otra sociedad que canceló los efectos de mayor correlación. No sé si quedó clara la pregunta.
Yeah, so as I said, we have an issue looking at individual countries because of power, right? Because we have relatively few observations in terms of rights in any country. I think the country that has most rights is Colombia, and it has 8 or 9 rights. However, having said that, the fact that we have country fixed effects should control for that, right? Should control for the fact that different countries have different political contexts. When we remove the country fixed effects, we do observe that the effect is positive. So again, no backlash regardless. So you do observe that increasing rights make people more in favor of, but again, I don't trust that result very much because precisely because of the, you do not have countries fixed effects.
Gracias, Lucas. ¿Algún otro comentario o pregunta?
No, a mí, no sé si está ahí.
Sí, Manuel.
Me parece muy interesante este tipo de investigación. Realmente está existiendo como una revolución silenciosa. Y la pregunta que le quería decir a Lucas, hay dos temas que veo. Digamos, desde Wapor también estamos como interesados en esto y vamos a hacer también otro webinar sobre el tema de género. Si Lucas piensa que desde el diseño de los cuestionarios las preguntas le parecen apropiadas para medir estas nuevas identidades, ¿no? Porque a veces utilizamos como las viejas preguntas y quizás hay que utilizar nuevas preguntas para poder detectar cambios que están en la sociedad. Y la otra cosa que me parecía interesante de preguntar es, no solo desde la perspectiva de la aceptación o rechazo de los derechos civiles, sino desde el hecho de si hay algún tipo de evidencia en cambios en la autopercepción del género, o decir, si estos movimientos LGTB, digamos, también pueden impactar como en un cambio si hay algunos cambios en lo que son las autopercepciones de género en la sociedad en general, a raíz de esta revolución silenciosa, por así decirlo, que está ocurriendo en el mundo, en Latinoamérica, y que abarca, como dijo Fabián, no solo LGTB, sino el derecho de los animales, el medio ambiente, etc. Básicamente era eso, si pensaba Lucas que los cuestionarios se necesitan nuevas preguntas, y el tema de la autopercepción de género, si hay algún cambio que sepa o que sea interesante destacar, o si existe. No sé si quedó claro.
Yeah, so great questions. I think the first one, I'm pretty sure those questions are somewhat outdated, but that is the issue of doing research with time series, right? So you want to keep the questions as closely as possible to the original one so that you can observe how it evolves over time. But so I think, yes, I think those questions are probably not ideal and how we would phrase them today in 2022, in 2021. But we do not have an option if we want to take like a broader view of the situation. Yes, there is unfortunately very little change. There's very little we can do about the fact that we want to use a very similar questionnaire over time. That is the first thing. The second thing I want to ask, to answer your second question, I'm not 100% sure that I followed your question, but I think you're asking like to what extent it's linked to different perceptions of gender. And I'm sure that, LGBT rights are intrinsically linked to issues of feminism and to the fight for women's rights. So yes, I'm sure that if you were to look at how, at the association between, and for that matter, females tend to be more in favor of LGBT rights than men. So yeah, so I think that is linked. If you're asking though, if people are just perceiving themselves to be more gender fluid, I think that is less likely. The percentage of the population who identifies as anything other than cisgender is tiny, and usually not captured in surveys.
Okay, thank you.
Gracias, Manuel. Gracias, Lucas. ¿Algún otro comentario o pregunta? Bueno, por ahora no tenemos otros comentarios. No sé, Lucas, si te parece adecuado hacer algún tipo de observación más final o vinculado con las etapas que siguen del estudio, los desdoblamientos que puede tener, y con eso ya iríamos encerrando esta presentación.
No, just thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the great questions and feedback. This is extremely helpful and insightful. So thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation, Fabian. So, and sorry for not speaking Spanish. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, una vez más, muchísimas gracias, Lucas, por tu disposición y por la interesantísima pesquisa, estudio que nos has compartido. Y muchísimas gracias entonces a todos los que acompañaron. Gustavo no ha podido estar, pero bueno, me pidió que los saludara a todos de parte de la presidencia de Wapor Latam. Nuevamente los invitamos a que acompañen nuestras actividades. Tendremos un ciclo de presentaciones que se extiende, que sigue de hecho en septiembre. Tal vez en agosto consigamos hacer algún evento, pero seguramente tenemos ya 2 eventos, uno en inicio de septiembre, otro finales de septiembre. Recibirán los alertas y links para inscripción por email. Y bueno, y que acompañen también nuestras actividades y hagan parte, nos gustaría que también hagan parte de nuestra asociación. Trabajos como lo de Lucas ya tiene un encaminamiento para una de las publicaciones, pero Lucas, nos interesaría sí que contemplaras la posibilidad de otras derivaciones que pudieran circular también por la revista latinoamericana de opinión pública. Mariano Torcal justamente es uno de los editores, junto con Ryan Carlin, y estamos creciendo de forma muy fuerte, entonces es un canal muy interesante, principalmente para dialogar con la audiencia latinoamericana, tanto académica como profesional, de practitioners en el área de opinión pública. Entonces, una vez más, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos y bueno, tengan una linda tarde a todos. Muchas gracias, Lucas.
¿Puedo añadir una cosita más respecto a la revista?
Claro.
Por favor, síganos en Twitter, háganse seguidores de la revista en Twitter. Estamos ya prácticamente cerrados 2 issues muy interesantes, especiales, sobre el efecto de COVID y sobre the forecasting elections, que ya están. El segundo, por ejemplo, está editado por Levis Beck y realmente creo que los próximos números van a ser espectaculares. Y bueno, invito a todo el mundo a seguirnos en Twitter, porque iremos anunciando en Twitter los first views de todos los artículos y los números cuando estén ya enteros, etcétera. Por tanto, insistir simplemente en lo que ha dicho el vicepresidente, Fabián Echegaray. Muchas gracias por coordinar todo esto, e insistir en que por favor nos sigáis en Twitter y que hagáis difusión de las publicaciones, y que por supuesto animaros a todos, including you, Lucas, to consider the possibility of sending something at the journal. I'm sure you will get good comments, and it will be very interesting to see you and your work published there as well. We are not a journal of politics, but we are growing. Okay. Gracias, Fabián. Gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias, Mariano. Únicamente para comentarles a todos y a todas que pues, esta presentación que nos ha hecho el favor Lucas esta mañana va a estar disponible próximamente en nuestros canales, en el canal de YouTube, por si desean consultar. Entonces, pues nada más agradecer a Lucas la presentación del día de hoy, agradecerle mucho a Fabián la gestión de esta charla esta mañana, y a todos y todas ustedes muchas gracias por su acompañamiento en esta interesante charla. Nos vemos próximamente en un seminario próximo de Wapor Latam. Que tengan todos un excelente viernes y por supuesto un excelente fin de semana.
Gracias, muchas gracias, Lucas.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, muy interesante.